There you go.
There you go. Yeah, yeah. And so I am sharing my screen. Thank you very much for such a gracious introduction. There was one thing I was going to mention in relation to my background is that when I left the Navy, I actually went to law school, which was very early on. I was only in the Navy a few years. I went to law school and then I came in the Army as a judge advocate and I specialized in government procurement law. And so a lot of my practice and my background is related to my experiences with, giving advice and counsel to activities, government activities and components, both deployed in Afghanistan and Kuwait, and also back in the United States about, how the government goes about acquiring the good or service they need to put it on target, on time, to defeat the enemy in a lot of cases, or it could be to, help service members and then ultimately, indirectly, of course, meet their objectives there. And so I get a lot of my experience from that. But this presentation itself is called Govcon 101, and really it's comprised of a bunch of information that I've kind of gleaned over my career in government procurement, both giving advice and counsel to government agencies and activities, but also, now that I represent companies, small and mid-sized companies doing business with the government, and those folks that are doing asset protection and estate plan, I uh, I I thought with government contracts, I put some of my thoughts down that are kind of like, in Louisiana, they call it lagniappe, that little bit extra, that context, that information about government contracts that you really don't get elsewhere other than experience, or their concepts I like to share with my clients so they are better able to succeed in their government contracting ventures. And so the presentation itself, as you can see, sorry about that. I've got next to it the gouge. That was a term we use in the Navy sometimes. It's just, hey, just get to the point, right? Give me the gouge. I had an old man define it for me when I first got in the Navy. He said, it is that which you need to know and nothing else. And I thought, oh, that's perfect. I love it. I've used that, 100 times, over the years. But that's really what I'm giving you here. I'm giving you some context, a little bit of gouge about government contracts that I've gleaned over my career, but also my practice. And it's, assisted and helped in a great way small and mid-sized businesses that are trying to do business with the government because of certain, assumptions they have or lack of experience or infamiliarity with the process. And so, again, I appreciate you tuning in just to enjoy the presentation. I appreciate your comments at the end. But what we'll do is we'll kind of talk about, three big components. The first is I got 7 bullet points I want to talk about that are essential information, or what I deem as essential information in doing business with the government. And so I have up there for government contract success, GovCon success, and knowing this stuff and having it guide and inform your decisions absolutely impacts your ability to succeed with government contracting. Secondly, we're going to talk about within those components how the contracting system and process works. And so I'll offer you a little bit of insight in the different entities that work together to actually get something on time and on target for a government agency. And so it may be something that you know or maybe something you don't know, but it's super helpful in understanding why the government acts in one way or another. The third thing we'll talk about is the consequences for non-compliance with the government contract, because at one point we'll talk about compliance and the importance of it. And I get asked so many times, in my practice anyway, when we're doing cost benefit analysis for certain things, they'll say, "What happens if I don't do it? What happens?" And so we'll hit that at the very end. So our agenda is talking about those things. And so without any further ado, let's go ahead and get to the essential information for government contract success. The first thing, some of these, and I'll preface it just a little bit, there are 7 bullet points we're going to cover. Each one of these bullet points, they may seem intuitive, they may seem kind of simple, but they're things that I felt prompted to kind of put out there, over the years, just so that we can have them as discussion points to explain why it is that, it is on this list. And so the first thing happens to fall into that category, which is I have a lot of clients that don't realize who they're trying to do business with, and so if you're in a government contract, the other party to the contract is the United States government, and so you as the small business or the mid-sized business or even the big business is doing business with the United States government. The other party is the largest single spender on earth. Next year, we're going to spend over, us being the government representing the people, like we are going to spend over $4 trillion. That's a ton of money. That's more money than the net worth of any of the other private companies, pretty much, right? And so, even though you think big company, you think of IBM or Tesla, down here in Austin, I live in Austin, you think of all these big companies, IBM, stuff like that. Those are big companies. Yeah, but really you're doing business with the largest spender, the most complex contracting partner that exists. Think about it. So the government itself in service contracts is going to spend over $660 billion this year. A lot of those are going to be set aside for small business and all that. And, they're required to do it by law, or they wouldn't do it. I can tell you from giving advice and counsel, on the other side. And, I've given counsel on, $50 acquisitions and a $1 billion contracts. And so they want to set aside things. The reason why they have to set aside things is because of statutory requirements, and it's the law for them to do it. Congress is forcing them to do it, and I love it. But that means you have small businesses doing, contracting with a much more sophisticated, much more powerful, and a much more well-supported contracting party, right? And so that's significant because a lot of small businesses and a lot of businesses in general think, well, I have a relationship with X over at the government, and so they like me. Okay, yeah, and that's probably true. You want to maintain relationships, you want a very congenial relationship and all that other stuff. But when the government is doing acquisition planning, what they're trying to do is satisfy requirements, right? The government needs something to do something. They need fighter aircraft, they need tanks, they need, construction services to build buildings, they need, porta potties, they need all the things that they need, but they need it to execute their mission, right? And so it's not just to spend money for the sake of spending money or to promulgate, small businesses and help stand them up and things like that. It's not that. It is there's a requirement over there. And so though they may like you, though you might have been at this command, though you might have been at this agency and all that, they still have an objective. They have a requirement and they have elements that they have to hit to actually, meet those objectives and things like that. And so the notion that, hey, they're going to do this just because they like you, that just really doesn't apply there. That's the United States government. They represent all the people. The government itself has a federal acquisition system that's embodied in the federal acquisition regulation as far as execution-wise. It executes all the policy and statute that is dictated to them as to how they have to spend the people's money. And they have, agency supplements that actually supplement those rules that tell the government exactly how they have to put out solicitations, how they have to compete things, how they have to set things aside, how they have to go through the process to actually acquire something. And so they have their own acquisition system, right? Well, they also have the largest law firm in the world to defend them, in cases where they get accused of doing the wrong thing. And certainly you can go into litigation with the government, but they have huge assets and stuff like that to defend themselves. And so not only that, you have to consider that the other party is a sovereign, right? Sovereign means the highest power. And so if they are the highest power, they also decide, hey, who can sue them, why they can sue them, what processes they're going to go through, and to what limit somebody can recover. And so, most people don't appreciate that, so when you're contracting and you're signing an agreement, this government contract, that's what you're signing up to, right? You're signing up to do business with that. And, certainly in some of the research programs that are out there in SBIR or, regular, government contracting stuff or architectural engineering services or, just service contracts and things like that, most people don't really appreciate that fully. And so I like to put that up there as number one, right? Just as soon as the person that you're friendly with or you're, even if, you were a leader in one of these agencies or something like that, as soon as you rotate out, new people come in, different ideas, different priorities, maybe the relationship severs right there. Even so, they still have to go through all the processes that are required by law for them to do. And so those are the things that you can depend on. And we're going to talk about more of those things later, but just remember who you're dealing with. It's not a commercial vendor that you're dealing with. It's not somebody that you can really put a lot of leverage, a lot of pressure on to speed them up or slow them down or make them negotiate outside of their envelope. It's the United States government. Number two, the United States government does business through representatives. And those representatives don't always know everything about the acquisition system. Remember, it is the government. They have their own acquisition system. We already talked about that a little bit, as documented in the FAR and agency supplement and other policy memorandum guidance. They have limitations on how they can act and, how they can set things aside, how much competition, all this sort of stuff is out there. But it's important to know that the person that you're dealing with may not be a full expert in everything that has to do with a government acquisition. A lot of my clients just assume that because somebody works in the federal government and they're a contracting officer or a contracting specialist, or they're related to a program office or related to the procurement in some sort of way, maybe they're a technical advisor or something like that, that they know everything about the acquisition system. And so think about that just a second. And then, okay, we know that's not true, right? That's not true. I can tell you, empirically that is not true. The acquisition workforce is actually younger than it has been in the last 50 years. Right now, you have least experienced contracting officers, contracting officer representatives, and folks dealing with government contracts right now. And so you have in situations where people have an unlimited warrant to obligate the government on the government side that has 2 or 3 or 4 years of experience in government contracting, and that's for an unlimited warrant. And so it used to take a lot longer to get that because there were a lot more information, a lot more understanding that you needed to actually perform and to do that job. But right now, the experience level is so low that they're needing people to award those contracts that have less experience than they used to have in the past. But that being said, the federal acquisition regulation, if you got it in hard text, it's way over 1,000 pages, and each agency supplement is over 1,000 pages. I mean, it's a complex system. It takes a while to learn. Even the folks in the field that I've known for 20 years that have worked in almost every area with litigation and acquisition reform, folks that are giving advice and counsel how we ought to change the law. They won't say that they're experts, in hardly anything. They'll get real small about what they're an expert in because it's such a expansive and vast system. It's hard to know everything about the system. And certainly your contracting officer or your contracting officer specialist or representative doesn't either. They are hired, they rotate out pretty frequently, and it takes a long time to develop all the expertise that you need to understand how to work the government procurement system and how to utilize all of the flexibility that it has. And so just because you're talking with somebody that is a contracting officer, it doesn't mean that they know everything about even the simple questions that you're asking, and so that's a lot of times why there's a lot of delay in correspondence and things like that. But just don't assume that they know everything. If you're able to find out information, and I do a fair amount of educating back to the federal government, to contract specialists, to contracting officers, to contract attorneys about what the envelope is, where they can act, where they're, what their latitude is, what authority provides it, and things like that. And so you shouldn't be nervous in doing that too. So don't assume they know everything just because somebody from the government says that. And so I've been talking specifically about contracting officers and contracting representatives. This applies also to senior officials, right? If you're not in contracting and you're, for instance, I was in the Army, right? If you have a general officer that's a 3-star general, he has a lot of power to direct, everybody beneath him to do whatever. Well, he doesn't really have any acquisition authority. He just drives the requirement. Hey, we need all this fuel on time, on target here, so we can, have this, prong of the attack already, or maybe we're going to use the CERT program to, utilize to spend some money to build infrastructure in this kind. He understands some of the concepts like that, but he has absolutely no idea really about how the system works as far as the federal acquisition regulation, the requirements for solicitation, proposal, competition, and all the things that go along with it. And so, unless he's in acquisitions and he's been in them for a while, he's probably not that familiar with it, and he knows what he needs, but the actual method by which he could get it and the different methods by which he can get it wouldn't be something he would be an expert in. That goes for very senior civilians as well. And so just because they're in the government doesn't mean they know everything about how the government works, or especially the procurement system, because it's kind of complex. Number 3, that government representative that you're probably talking to or dealing with, within the DoD or any other agency, probably doesn't know that much about commercial acquisition or commercial contracting either. If you think about it, most of them were not entrepreneurs. They weren't business owners, or they're starting up businesses, and they don't really understand, whether it's, going for investment or setting up businesses, or, setting up business systems and compliance costs, really what goes into overhead and all the things that go along with it. And so, they're kind of limited. As a matter of fact, in my experience, most, contracting officers that hadn't been, in that position that long, base a lot of their experiences on their personal acquisitions in the commercial marketplace, which is, maybe they bought a car at one point, maybe they had a mortgage, that was, they bought a house, or maybe they, contracted for support services, something like that. So they're basing pretty much their knowledge about commercial contracting, the process, on that. And that doesn't mean they have a lot of experience with, investment and going for, a series raise or something like that, but they might read about it and kind of understand some of the topics. Just know with point 2 and 3 that, hey, on the other side, they don't know everything. And they need some education every once in a while to help them get to where you think you're allowed to go. If you have a question or something like that related to your contract, or you want to do something, make a modification, or, whatever, sometimes you're educating back to those parties to let them know that, hey, you can absolutely do this. This is what I want to do. And this, I've done it for you. All you have to do is X to make it happen, that sort of thing. But yeah, you can absolutely do that. And they actually embrace that, after a period of time. But where I see companies doing business with the government have struggled with a little bit is they just assume that, okay, well, just because this is a senior official, he's a director of X, Y, Z, or he's a contracting specialist or something like that, they know everything. Not the case. Not the case at all. Number 4, the government itself is huge, and the authority to bind the government comes in very limited forms and packages. In government contracting, it goes through something I mentioned a little bit earlier, which is a warrant, right? A contracting officer has a warrant to be able to obligate the government to a certain dollar amount or within a certain scope. And so, it might be that they're just getting into it and they can, they can do anything up to the simplified acquisition threshold, or maybe they've been a little bit longer and it's unlimited, or it's, has to do with just with, parts or services, or whatever the limitation on the warrant is. But they get a warrant to bind the government, right? And so they go through a process, an educational process that's requires a little bit of a, in class and probably online training and certification, but ultimately they'll get a warrant that says, hey, okay, now you're a contracting officer, you can bind the government up to this amount, and you can make changes to the contract and stuff like that are related to it. And so there are specific people that have that. And so the people that sign your contract and identify themselves as a contracting officer are saying that, hey, I have this warrant to do this, and so that's the person that you want to get direction from. That authority to obligate the government is nested in a contracting officer. It's not vested in a specialist, contracting specialist. It's not, nested in a contracting representative. It's not nested in a commander, or, or, a vice commander, or, somebody like that that's, in the military just because they wear a lot of ornamentation. It doesn't nest in those folks. It nests in a specific person for a specific scope, and up to a specific amount. And so sometimes they're unlimited, like I said earlier, but this person has an authority to do that. If somebody outside of that obligates the government, they call it an unauthorized commitment, and you got to go through a process to have somebody with authority ratify it if they will do it. And it is a painstaking process to do it. The reason why I mention this here is that if you're wanting to be in government contracting, or you're performing government contracts right now, you want to make sure that any direction that you get that changes your contract performance in any way, especially if it's going to change the cost of performance, that you get that in writing through email or letter or whatever it is from the contracting officer, right? From the contracting officer, no one else, not the specialist, not the the person with authority. As a matter of fact, if you look at your contract, in the terms and conditions, I know those contracts can get quite long. I looked at one a couple of years ago that had 162 clauses on it. 85 of them were incorporated by reference, meaning it was just number and title, and it was 4 pages of just a list of. And I thought, man, that seems like a lot, and it does. It is a lot, but within all those clauses, there's usually some language in there that talks about unauthorized commitments and who can obligate on this contract. And so it'll identify the contracting officer, and it'll also have that language in there that says, hey, nobody else. And so you want to get in writing from the contracting officer direction to change your performance outside of what already has been agreed to. And you might say, well, that's obvious, but I got to tell you, just through experience, it is so easy for somebody, especially that's a senior decision maker or a supervisor or something like that, to come through to talk to your employees or to talk to you and say, hey, we would really like for you to do this. We know the contract says this. We want you to do this, and you'll try to comply with it. And you'll say, they promised to pay me. They promised to help me. They directed me to do it. And everybody will be sympathetic to you. But you'll go back to the contracting officer and say, hey, here's my bill. And the contracting officer will say, hey, I didn't tell you to do this. Who told you to do this? The contract says you take direction from me. And so then you'll have something called a dispute, or you could have that. Know this. If you only remember one thing from this presentation, remember this piece of it. Take your direction from the contracting officer that's assigned to your acquisition. Get it in writing. If they're directing you to do stuff, especially if it's not within the scope of the contract, if they're making any changes to it, get it in writing so that you can actually have an equitable adjustment later on and be made whole. You're going to bear those costs. You're going to try to perform. You're going to be the best partner the government ever had, but you shouldn't go out of business doing it. And especially if the government is directing you to do it. They have responsibilities to pay for things. I had a federal judge tell a friend of mine one time when he was in front of him, he was arguing that the government ought to get, these items that were on some land for free because they didn't ask for them, and it wasn't eminent domain. They were, the person that put something on there, and the judge stopped him right there, and he looked at him and he said, "Hey, counsel, are you telling me that the government ought to get things for free?" And it put, my partner in kind of or my friend anyway, kind of in a pickle a little bit, And so the answer in that situation was, hey, the government doesn't get things for free. As a matter of fact, if the government is going to get something for free as a gift, there are specific statutes that deal with how the government or every agency is going to deal with gifts, how they have to receive them, how they have to be processed, and how they can be considered, and in what circumstances they can get them. It's not the intent for them to actually get a lot of free stuff, especially from small businesses that are there. So be careful about that sort of thing. But know that a contracting officer is the person that you want to give you direction, and you want to get that direction right. And so number 5 is all about the acquisition process. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, the government's acquisition process is controlled by the Federal Acquisition Regulation and agency supplement, right? And so there's a lot of different agencies and components that have different supplements that help tell them specifically what to do. That's, vary it somewhat or further explanation about the requirements in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. The good thing is that at least there's guidance out there. It can be layered, it can be complex, it can be frustrating to read. I mean, certainly. But the good thing is it's out there, and the government's got to follow it. Now, if they, whether they know it or not, whether they know about it or not, they have to follow it. And then that's helpful to government contractors because it makes it a little bit more predictable in the process. And so I wanted to talk a little bit, as I promised, in your agenda, to talk about the acquisition process or how contracting works through this chart. And it wasn't like I was going to go into every element on the chart. It really allowed me a chance, or allows me this chance, to kind of talk about acquisitions as it relates to an acquiring activity, which is on the left side of this graph, and a government contractor on the right, right? And so naturally the contracting activity is specialized, informed, educated with contracting officers and all the folks that should be able to go acquire the good or service on behalf of the agency that needs the requirement, right? And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's a specific process for them to do it. What you don't know, or you may not fully appreciate, is that if you have a command or a component or an agency that's going to go get something, they usually have a specialized department, command, or an activity that has some training, understands how to go and acquire things to some extent, and they're the ones actually drafting the contract, putting out the solicitation, articulating the requirement. And so that's important, right? To have some people that can actually operate in that space a little bit, to at least understand the terminology. What you may not fully appreciate is that all the requirements for an agency are driven by the doers, right? The people that go out and do the agency mission. For the military, it's the war fighters, right? In the DoD, the warfighter drives the requirement. The commander sets the strategy and commander's intent. They identify what they're going to do. They put together a strategic and tactical plan to execute whatever mission they're going to do. And there are a lot of little sub elements beneath that, or little things that they have to get to actually execute that mission. For instance, in Afghanistan, before we built up in 2010 to 100,000 people in Afghanistan, we had to pre-place and make sure that there were a lot of things in different provinces on different posts, so that when these people arrived, they actually had, the things that they needed to survive. And so I'm kind of laughing a little bit, because the thing that pops into my mind all the time with that is porta potties. I mean, we contracted for so many porta potties to put in these areas so they could kind of, and there were 1,000 other things we did too. But that's one of the things I remember is like, okay, well, it's making sure that we're taking care of those things. Well, of course, the command was driving it. They were putting, people there. We were going to put personnel there. But the contracting activity, which is on the left-hand side of this, was the people that were actually, okay, this is what they said they needed. Let me put together the requirement, put out the solicitation, get the good or service so that we can actually, perform the mission. And so you had the requiring activity and you had the contracting activity. And so at the top of this graph, you see requiring activity and contracting activity. And so really, this is a lot more complex than it shows. But I have this up here so I can just show you a lot of the things that the government does. Of course, they are required by the FAR to go through some acquisition planning, to develop a solicitation, to publicize the solicitation, to receive proposals, evaluate those proposals, and then award it, right? And so the FAR will talk about the process by which you're going to do all those things. And then certainly once they award it, how they would go through a contract change and all that other stuff. Well, of course, on the right side of this graph, these are all things that contractors are doing, in relation to all that, as they're trying to identify what they need, plan for how they're going to require it, and then acquire it. Of course, the contractor on the right-hand side is doing business development. They're trying to figure out what that requirement is, and help, shape that requirement so that they can provide it, on the front end. And certainly when a solicitation comes out, it's asking questions to do the same, or to clarify what the government really needs here so they can put in a proper bid or proposal, and then it's perform the contract. You have all these things going on. And so though it all relates to the Federal Acquisition Regulation, more often than not, sometimes other transactions or other vehicles for government contracting, there's a direct and kind of measurable process by which the government's going to go through. Now, not one of them is an expert in all phases of it, but it's there. It's there if you spend some time and look into it a little bit. What I like to do is kind of be cognizant of that. From this chart, I would take away that, hey, okay, well, the contracting activity is usually going to go and acquire the good or service. A requiring activity where your technical representative is, or maybe your contracting officer or representative, who's going to be on site and on target for the delivery of the goods or services. The requiring activity, know how they relate to the contracting activity, which is, they're directing the requirement. Hey, we really need this thing. We set aside some monies to buy it. Go out and contract for it. And so they send it over the contracting activity, and they go through this process. And so if you step back a little bit, this is, at a very, very high level, these are very common activities that you have in a business, right? And the first thing you do is you try to figure out who your customer is. You do market research. You decide, who needs the thing, how you want to deliver it. You do some acquisition planning, and getting the things you need to deliver what it is, good or service that you have. But on the other side, whoever your target is doing some acquisition planning on figuring out how it is they're going to acquire the thing. And so you have this market research, acquisition planning. You have a period of competition and award. Once the target's kind of identified, hey, I really need this thing, they have to compete it. There's a level of competition. If you're in government contracting, there's, FAR Part 6 talks about the competition. Standard default is full and open. They can set it aside for certain things upon certain justifications, of course, for small businesses or emergencies and, all the things. And there's 6 reasons to, really to sole source some stuff. And so there's specific authority to be able to do a lot of things. But you're going through that process to compete, right? You want to limit the competition as much as you can, but within whatever set aside that you're in, usually you're competing against, other people that are in your field have the technical or the technology or the service that the government wants, but you're competing for that sort of thing. And then once you're awarded the contract, you're in performance. And so at a very high level, it's very much like some commercial contracts. And so I hear this all the time when I go to speak at different accelerators or conferences or Apex accelerators or old PTACs, right? And I talk about that. You hear a lot of folks saying, "Hey, this is just like commercial contracting." And I think that when they're saying that, they're exaggerating just a little bit because, at a very high level, yeah, there's really a lot of similarities. But if you get in the micro level and kind of look at the FAR and all the things that go on and the form you have to be in to litigate disputes and all that other stuff, it's nothing like it at all. But it does have some similar features in that, hey, you're always going to do some market research. You're always going to be in competition with whoever's in your field. And you're always going to perform the contract when you're done. At that level, yeah, it's very, very similar. But in the micro, maybe not. But I thought this was helpful, or could be helpful to you to kind of understand, number one, some of the processes. Number two, that if you're a contractor trying to do it in the business with the government, the person you're usually talking to in the contracting officer is in the contracting activity. The person that really requires the good or service 99% of the time is not in the contracting activity. It's in a command or an agency or an organization somewhere else that said, hey, I need this, contracting agency, go do it. And so that agency, whoever needs, the landscaping services, is certainly not the contracting activity, right? That's the agency itself. That's the building maintenance crew or whatever it is, and so they're driving the requirement. Hey, we need the grass cut this often, this high, with this type of cut, those. And so you have three organizations kind of working, or two organizations working together, the other organization trying to figure out what the other two are doing. And that would be, of course, you, the contractor, right? Trying to figure out what the government needs and how they're going to acquire it. And so I thought it would be helpful for you to kind of understand that, because a lot of clients, they kind of wonder about, why does it take so long for the government to get back with me when I ask simple questions? Like, I sent a question to the contracting officer that really has more about technical specifications on what the requiring activity needs, right? Or any changes that they might have made or stuff like that. Well, they're usually talking to somebody outside of their organization, right? When you do that, it just kind of elongates a lot of the response time. And so the government has a process, which we kind of went, very quickly through, and they have to follow it. If they don't follow it, then obviously you might have a dispute. You might have a protest, for the award piece of it. Or you might have a claim, as far as, for a contract change or something like that, or something they're directing you to do, maybe a contracting decision that you want to register a claim about. But they have a process, and they have to follow it. And they do have mechanisms like the protest and claims and things like that allow you to hold them to some level of account. And so the sixth thing I was going to mention is that the Federal Acquisition Regulation actually has a ton of tools inside of it that a good contracting officer can use to almost do anything. And so when people say, hey, acquisition reform is really important, we need to change the system and all that, that's probably going to not happen too much, going in the future. Everything that you want to do, that you've dreamed up, or, a command dreams up, or, an organization dreams up, you can probably do through the present system. It's just complex and convoluted a little bit, and it's hard to maneuver, but you can do it, and so those folks that have been there a long time, that are kind of the experts in the field and stuff like that, they can navigate that thing very well. I had a friend of mine, I used to do this too, is that, it's like driving a Maserati. The FAR is like a Maserati, and if you don't know anything about the FAR, or you're not that familiar with it, or you don't have a lot of experience with it, you can't drive that Maserati like a Maserati. You're going to drive it like a Ford F-150, if that's what you drive. But you have experience. But if you have experience, if you understand what all it can do and how it can do it, then you can get the full use out of that Maserati, and you can do some fantastic things. Well, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, not everybody has that much experience in it. And it's also something that you learn, and the new stuff that you learn is tough to wield sometimes. But I say all that to focus down on is that, hey, there's a lot of tools within the FAR. A contracting officer is not going to use them until it's necessary for them to use them, but they will absolutely use them. Somebody eventually is going to tell them, talk about the issue that has popped up and be able to help them with it. And they will absolutely use everything to their benefit. You are a party to a contract. They have interests and you have interests. They're not going to tell you what all their interests are. They're going to tell you some of them and partial what those interests are. But they're not going to tell you everything. And so they might, have a kind of a different plan for longevity, especially with your contract, or a different thought about your performance, or, even though they're telling you you've been performing satisfactory, they may be, not that thrilled with your performance. And so they're not going to ding you and give you negative feedback, because that takes a little bit more time and effort to do, right? To go through the process. But they're just going to go with some lukewarm ratings and then kind of, maybe not exercise the option on your contract and kind of move on. Certainly they can do that, and they absolutely will do it. And you see it in every type of contract that's out there, whether it's, research and development, or it's in the SBIR program. I see that most often than not. And people, a lot of clients will think, well, I'm in this program. They really, the government really needs whatever it is I've got, whatever innovation I've got. And yeah, absolutely. They're probably really interested in that. Well, their interest may wane with either the amount of money that they have in that program, or maybe they got new leadership and they want to kind of change the emphasis of the program. They want to take what they were invested in your company and the research and development and put it somewhere else. That stuff happens. And they have a lot of tools to be able to do stuff like that, like a termination for convenience, which you don't normally have in commercial contracting, unless you can help it. But the government always has that option. Hey, just for our convenience, we're going to terminate this contract. And so there's a settlement process and all that. But they can absolutely do that and not receive any breach damages. And so, all those tools and the acquisition system that are at the disposal of the contracting officer, they might use it. And if they won't use it, then maybe, whoever falls on their job and, rotate through contracting officers and program managers and command leadership quite often, that this all might come into play. So you want to kind of think about it and understand what they are and be able to plan for it a little bit. The last point I was going to make about essential information for Govcon success is the point that compliance with a government contract is a little bit harder than you think, and it always requires more than you think. And so, as you know, in government contracting, the federal government likes to implement a lot of trying to think of a nice way to say it, a lot of their policy directives and things like that through government contracting, requiring government contractors to perform in a certain way. And so you saw a lot of that in COVID, where they said, hey, we want to make sure that all our contractors are getting a COVID vaccine. And so contracting, sent directives that, hey, all the folks here had to get certifications they had COVID vaccine, Well, that's kind of a contract change, but they do implement a lot of regulatory activity through contract administration. And so you see that in a lot of the contract clauses, where they say, hey, we have all these ethical limitations that are involved in the governance of the contract itself. They have the NIST 800 171 cybersecurity requirements and the safeguarding of information, compliance requirements that are there. Of course, the cost and accounting system compliance requirements there, and the due diligence on not spending any government money on unallowable costs, and all the things that go along with it. Contract compliance takes more time and effort than you think it will, and it costs a little bit more in time and money than you think it will. And so make sure that you take that into consideration when you're developing a proposal, right? And you may not have the exact number that your compliance for a contract is going to be, but make sure that you contemplate that compliance into your cost estimate for the government, because I can guarantee you they're going to hold you to account to all the clauses that are in that contract, all 160 of them in some cases, right? They're going to hold you to that. And so, and if you don't perform those things, it's technically a breach of contract or a default from their perspective. And so they can go after you in that way. And so what are the consequences for noncompliance? I get that question a lot. What can happen to you if you don't comply with the directions of the government? Well, before contract award, if you don't comply with the directions of the government in the preparation of your proposal, number one, they cannot consider it, right? So they can only award contracts to responsive bidders, right? And so responsiveness is the term of art that describes responding to all the requirements of the solicitation. And so if you didn't do that, if it's only supposed to be 4 pages, you did 4.5, they're not going to consider it. They might say, hey, we don't consider anything over 4 pages, or they might just not consider it at all, depending on, what they told you in the solicitation. But you have to give them all the information they want in the way they want it. If you're not responsive, you don't even get in the competition to get the award. Once you get the award, of course, you have all the contract clauses that are in there that require you to do certain things, to have a code of business ethics and conduct, or, to make sure that you're following an EEO, or, depending on how many employees you have, if you have a affirmative action program, or, whatever it is that the compliance requirement is having you do. Certainly those things are requirements of the contract. If you're not doing it, then technically it's a breach there. And so you can have, criminal and administrative penalties there. Some of the administrative penalties, civil and criminal penalties. You can also have administrative remedies that are involved with the government as well. The administrative sometimes are the more immediate things, in that, if they're worried about, some representations that you made, or your non-compliance, or maybe breach of the contract, they may, need to suspend you from performance further, and also investigate it, and so you can get a suspension or a debarment from government contracting, which means that they can't pay a claim, they can't give you a payment on anything, and you are suspended from further government contracting until such time as they reinstate you. Or debarment means you just can't do it, at all for a period of time. It's not permanent, but it's a long period of time. But it's administratively removing you from the ability to be able to receive finances for the government, and so you're not going to be performing in that way. And so those administrative remedies are very powerful. Well, you can also have civil or criminal penalties that go along with it too. Usually, the civil penalties relate to the False Claims Act, meaning that you submitted some sort of false claim, made a false representation or false statement or something like that to the government that they relied on to either award or pay on your contract. And so that can be kind of significant, right? And I have up there on the slide that, hey, in 2021 it was 5.6 billion, and I think in 23 it was 2.6 billion. But it was a ton of money that they get in judgments and settlements from the Department of Justice investigating companies for false representations or false claims, or other aspects of the False Claims Act, and them settling it, meaning they've been found guilty and settling them out, or maybe them pleading guilty and settling them out. The thing that I would note on that is that, hey, these are the people that were caught. Now, so many people that don't get caught means there's a lot of it going on. But, certainly that can be very costly. If you are in that situation, you're going to be suspended, probably debarred from further government contracting. You're also going to have, whatever settlement amount that you have in there, and whatever penalty they want to give you. Some of the criminal penalties that go along with it, are related to fraud. And so, criminal penalties that go along with fraud is that you can go to jail. And so all those things can come from misrepresentations that you're doing one thing and not the other. You're submitting for payment that you don't merit or warrant. That you are saying that you're a small business when you're really not. That you're saying your ownership is U.S. citizens when they're really not. And so those are some easy examples to utilize. But they're examples nonetheless, right? And so the Department of Justice, of course, come in, investigate a little bit, and try to figure out, okay, well, they're guilty, boom, what do we need to do with them? Let's see, what they say, of course, the Department of Justice says they look at 3 things. They look at whether you have a compliance program, whether it was run in earnest, whether you're doing it, and whether it was effective. And then they try to decide, how to deal with it. And obviously, if you really don't have a compliance program and it was a blatant misrepresentation, then you can bear some significant penalties. But there are significant penalties that go along with misrepresentations and fraud and all the things that go along with government contracting. And so you want to make sure that on the front end that you're taking care of that through your compliance activities, and certainly encompassing those costs in your proposal. So that being said, what we did today was talk a little bit about what I think is kind of essential to know in doing business with the government. There were 7 points that we covered that kind of ran the gamut from who you're doing business with. It's the federal government. They have their own processes. It is complex, and the information is out there, but it can be somewhat overwhelming. Certainly, if you're doing business with the government, know who you're doing business with, and know who can obligate that government, right? Who can do it, and that would be your contracting officer. Get all your stuff in writing from government contracting officers if they're asking you to change a contract. That is super important. Also, you want to know, about the system a little bit. You also want to know, what the penalties are for lack of compliance if something happens to you, because there are real penalties for not compliance. And really, knowing all that should kind of free you up to ask questions to your contracting officer or a contracting representative or specialist or whatever, and put a burden on them to kind of explain what's going on if you don't understand. If you looked into everything and you think that maybe they're doing the wrong thing, or you're the wrong vehicle, or they're taking you down the wrong path, stuff like that, don't be afraid to ask them questions and have them respond to you so that you can be on time and on target and avoid any problems a little bit later on. So that being said, if you have any questions for me, obviously my email is up there. You can reach out anytime you want to. But I appreciate you having me here. I'm glad I got a chance to talk a little bit about some of the neat little things about government contracting. But if you have any questions, Brandon, you offered that I'd answer some questions. I'd be happy to. I just have to see the questions, and so I
got a couple of questions for you. You got a lot of kudos in the chat, man. Thanks, a wonderful presentation. So I just want to first and foremost tell you thank you. This has been very enlightening. So we appreciate your expertise. But yes, let me got a couple of questions for you. One is, I have always viewed a negative CPOS as the kiss of death. Is it possible? Chat came up. Hold on 1 second. Is it possible for a company to recover from that?
So addressing the question straight on, is it possible for a company to recover? Yes, in large part. It depends on what information is in the negative CPARs. A negative CPARs is the contractor performance action report, right? How did they do on past performance? And, of course, they're going to cover certain things, and they're going to talk about how well that you performed in the contract, how your management did, and all the things that go along with it. And so there's going to be a lot of deference that's put in there. And so know that CPARs is used for future acquisitions when they start rating past performance, but it's also helpful for personnel and folks that are rotating through the contracting. So the thing that might not be intuitive is that so many times in a government contract, you have people rotating through the contract as the contracting officer or the specialist that they really don't have any, they don't really have any recollections on, or haven't really made a decision on whether or not they like your performance or anything else like that. When a new person comes in, they might get a little bit of handover, a little bit of information from the last person. But a lot of times you're looking a little bit at the CPARs of the company to kind of form that, okay, well, this is kind of what the last people thought about them. And so it shapes the way that everybody else kind of handles you as well during the contract. And so you want to, number one, make sure that you don't run into bad CPARs, or lukewarm CPARs or something like that. Number two, if you get one, you want to make sure that you have at least considered appealing those and requiring the government to substantiate some of it, right? Because I've had clients out there that had a negative CPARs where there was really no notice to the contractor, no sort of evidence of support for any of the crazy allocations. In my last one, there was some crazy stuff in it, that was just completely baseless. And so you might say that, hey, well, this is government, nothing like that would ever happen, and so I can tell you that stuff happens, and the government has a requirement that if they're evaluating your performance, that it has to be supported and substantiated, meaning that you had to have some notice of it and a chance to remediate, right? And if they didn't do all that, and if you're learning about their dissatisfaction with you in just the CPARs, you can't do anything about it, right? You're just taking the brunt of it, and it affects, number one, the number of sources that they have to get to get a thing, good or service. But number two, it kind of defeats the purpose of the CPARs, which is to help improve performance. The purpose of CPARs is, inform on future acquisitions and help improve performance. And so, if they're not telling you until after the fact, then you need to think about, go ahead and appeal those things, because you can require them to substantiate it through an appeal. And then, when they can't do it, then they have to give you, better CPARs, essentially at least a neutral or something like that.
So thank you. I think he was going on one of your slides, and somebody asked, could you list what is needed to create a Govcon pipeline?
A Govcon, yeah. And so when people are talking about a Govcon pipeline, more often than not, they're talking about, I guess, one or two things. They're either talking about a pipeline, a service providers that help them seek government contracts, right? And actually go out and find them, or they're talking about a situation to where they're actually looking for government requirements on, sam.gov or maybe GovWin or something like that, and they're trying to identify, what the future work's going to be, right? And so it's usually one of those two things. Taking the latter, because it's more likely they're asking about that, or I think you're asking about that, is how do you build that? What I like to do is, of course, I do research on my NAICS code in, if you're doing it for free and everything in sam.gov, where you're trying to figure out, are there any solicitations out there? What's been there? I look at on USA's spend as well, which talks about all the historical acquisitions that are out there, right? And there are other websites that the government has that kind of outline what spending they've had historically. What I know about the government is that they need everything. There are certain lists and a specific list of expenses that are unallowable, like purchasing alcohol, under most circumstances are provided to, and doing some illegal activities and stuff like that. But things that are not allowable, they can actually go out and purchase. And so the government is so big, it's so vast, their mission is so divergent that they need almost everything. They need psychologists and teachers and nurses and they need everything. And so you might think that, hey, I have really specialized expertise and, my product, is very limited because it does X. Well, even though that might be the case, more than likely it can either integrate into a larger program, a larger requirement, or it can be a standalone requirement of the government because they didn't know it existed, right? The government, they struggle, especially the DoD, they struggle with finding or identifying the state of the art in anything, right? Because they're doing their mission, right? And so a lot of times you're educating them and say, hey, I have this product, I have this service a little bit different than what's on the marketplace normally. It has this performance window that's out there. And then the wheels start turning, and they say, well, absolutely, that would totally, we would love to have that, and so that's part of the market research part of it.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, we got about 5 more minutes. Let's see a couple of questions, just a few more. Yes, this session has been recorded, and you all will receive the recording and presentation tomorrow morning. And next question: how would a company new to SAM get jobs when most jobs are looking for proof of experience in government contract?
Well, and so you want to build past performance, and you can do that in several kind of ways. And so a lot of things that are posted on SAM, they're outside of the simplified acquisition threshold, and so they're larger dollar items and stuff like that. Well, every command, every agency, they actually have requirements that are less than simplified acquisition threshold, less than $250,000, and they put those things out there on other sources. They don't put them all on sam.gov. And so, knowing where your government activity is, knowing where your contracting office is for the post or for the agency, so that you can follow whatever smaller requirements they have. If it's a micro purchase, under, I think it's $33,000 or $38,000 right now. It's kind of like whatever their credit card, authorization is. It's just right around, I think it's at $33,000. But they're able to go out and buy some things. Hey, start with that, right? It depends on what it is you're providing. If you're developing some software and whatever individual unit item you have is, a couple $100,000, then that's really not, going to be helpful to you unless you want to discount it. But for most folks, that are providing goods and services for government activities, that's exactly how you do it. You start small on some of the smaller contracts and vehicles that they have. You work through that process. You start looking at large primes and trying to team with them to go after larger acquisitions. You may or may not know, and I may be getting a little off track here, is that, even if it's a large contract, it's like, your Lockheed Martins or KBR and all that other stuff, they're getting a ton of money from the federal government. Well, there's also statutes that require them to look at small businesses and have small business subcontracting plans. Right. They're statutorily required to do it. They're reporting back what they're doing. They're reporting all the time, and they really want to work with small businesses. And so one of the ways to get into government contracting is being a subcontractor to a larger prime that is already in subcontracting, or in government contracting, so that you can perform and kind of build up some past performance, which it can be great. And those relationships can go on and really help your company, because some of them really like to mentor and help, especially in the innovation and software development and IT area. There's a lot of companies that like to help with that sort of thing, and so yeah, absolutely, there are different ways to get into it, and at least a couple of different avenues.
Awesome. Two more questions I see. One is there a list of priority items that the government looks for when going through the evaluation process?
Well, so there is, but they're not going to share that with you. I mean, what
Right.
they're going to share with you is what's in the solicitation, and it says, hey, we're going to look at these elements. If it's a best value or if it's a lowest price technically acceptable, they're looking at whether it's technically acceptable. And so they do have a list of what they're looking through, and they do give it to you because they give it to you in the solicitation. However, their application to what you've proposed and how they apply it to there is a little bit subjective in a lot of different ways. I mean, some of it is not, but a lot of it is. And so they're going to go into it kind of with, you know, with some leanings one way or the other, especially if they know all the participants, which they can and set that stuff aside. But obviously they're going to tell you, and how you can hold them account is they're going to tell you what they need, right? We need this good or service. They have to tell you how they're going to evaluate proposals, and they have to give you some criteria they're going to grade it by. Now, on the front end, if they put out a solicitation like that and it's not clear how they're going to grade or evaluate proposals, you want to ask questions about it. So putting out requests for information, posting to it so that everybody else can see the question too. You want to identify, hey, you're asking for this. This is really ambiguous. Can you definitize really what you meant by that? And then they'll give you an explanation, and everybody else will get it too. But you'll get that explanation, and it'll either be, it'll either confuse the issue or it'll help clarify the issue for you, so you make a better proposal and a more responsive proposal.
Awesome. Thank you. And the last one. Are there resources that a business that utilize retain to help navigate the contract submittal portion process?
So yes, yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, Brandon, I think your office does a fair amount of that, do they not?
We do, we do,
Yeah.
we do. As far as trainings, we have resources. Your local Apex accelerators, which are listed in the chat, they can assist you as well. So we provide resources to small businesses, advocate for you guys, and make sure that the procurement process, we try to make sure it's smooth for you. And before you go to, those other high levels, with trying to actually obtain those contracts. So we are your resource partners here. You can get those and retain them. I just put the VetBiz portal in the chat. I think I put it in the Q&A as well. You can find our trainers located there as well. Some of our subcontracting opportunities, our business opportunity sessions, you can find them there. You can sign up for those opportunities as well.
Right. Yeah. And so, there's a ton of them. And I'm just going to double down on the Apex accelerators. They're really good at helping you identify what your government market is and being able to look at your NAICS and try to find, your customers and things like that, and give you good information about how to start, identifying your pipeline. And so, yeah, absolutely. And so there's kind of like, and all that's pretty much free, and so most of that is non-cost. Maybe there might be ancillary cost for, like a business search or something like that. But most of that stuff is free whenever you kind of need to extend beyond that and do some things. I mean, because they'll talk about, hey, you can have a joint venture with X and Y and Z, and you can do all these things that kind of higher tier. Usually you have to kind of extend beyond that, the free services, and kind of go to a service provider to get some help with it, because you wouldn't, those entities are funded by the government, and the government can't give advice and counsel to both sides of the contract, right? And so you do have to go out elsewhere sometimes. But I would say foundationally that it's great to utilize all those free things, and there's actually some stuff online that's really good. The SBA has some fantastic trainings online that you can identify and leverage. I really like those. I really like also, if you're in innovation, the SBIR web page that they have that gives the tutorials about the program itself, but it also does talk about, once it goes beyond the SBIR program, government acquisition programs. And so you end up talking about export controls and a lot of the things that aren't discussed in a lot of other places. And so all that is absolutely free. It's just a lot of information, and navigating to it sometimes is not that fun, but there's good information out there.
Awesome, awesome. But thank you, Mr. Allen. This has been great. Before everybody leave, and see in the chat that you guys are doing some great networking, and that's what it's for. So please continue to definitely network with each other. Looking for those opportunities. Thank everybody for attending this training. This has been great. Once again, like I said earlier, this has been great information. You will see the survey once you finish. Once we finish with this webinar, or you log off. Please feel free to let us know how we did today. Now I know on the back end of it, it would ask you what's your socioeconomic status. Now, if you are, veteran certified through the SBA, it still does have VA certification. You can still click that to, recognize that it's SBA certified until those are changed. But other than that, I hope everybody has a great day. And we will see you guys later. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Allen.
No
And if
problem.
you need, and if anybody needs anything, please feel free to send me an email. I did put that in the chat. If you want to talk. Thank you. Hope everybody have a good day.
Thank you.